So I usually start all my interviews out by saying, asking, what is your name and what do you do?
I'm Cameron Abbott. I'm a lawyer and a writer.
And what books have you written?
I have 2 novels out right now, both from Hayworth Press. One's called To the Edge. That was my first novel in 2001. And the second novel is called An Inexpressible State of Grace. It's
So
a little bit of a tongue twister, but it's actually, that's a quote from a particular line in a Colette short story. And that also is a Hayworth Press book from 2004.
okay. How did the whole process begin? Did you go to law school first and start writing in law school after?
Oh no, I went to law school first. I've done a couple of things. I mean, I was in graduate school for a while studying theater, dramaturgy. And after that, I was in the theater for a number of years here in New York City, not as an actress. Not as an actress.
Musical theater, right?
Right. Not even that. No, I was more in the administrative side of things. And then I decided to go to law school, so I went to law school, and I was out practicing probably 7 or 8 years before I decided to write a novel.
And it just started to flow once you started to write?
Well, yeah, it actually did. It's funny that you put it that way, because the way I write, I didn't know it until I tried it. I sit down. Everybody has a different way of doing these things, but this is my way. I sit down with a legal pad, and I start on page. Of course, a legal pad, right? And I start at the very beginning, and I have no idea where it's going to go. And I just write. That's how I sat down and started my first novel. And I still have those legal pads. 6 legal pads later, 3 weeks later, the book was done.
Wow.
I mean, it came very quickly. It really just, boom, came out. And I had no idea what was going to happen next in the book more than maybe 5 pages in advance. I mean, it was really just an organic kind of thing, written out by hand. And I still have those legal pads in my house. And if you look at the very first one, the very first scribbled hand, I mean, as my secretary, my handwriting is terrible. I should have gone to med school. It's barely comprehensible, but you read the very first line, and it is the very first line of that book. And you could just read the book. Of course, I made changes. I edited things along the way. I would go back, reread something, scratch it out, write something on the back of the page. Yeah. I reworked things as I sort of went through the review process. But for the most part, the book starts on page 1 of the first page of the legal pad, and it ends at the end of the 6th legal pad. That was my process. That's how I do it. And the second book, the same thing. I mean, it was 7 legal pads, and I started at the beginning. I worked my way through to the end.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what? It was just out of the blue one day. You just sat down with a legal pad and you were like, "I'm gonna write a book."
In a way, that's how it happened. I read a lot of lesbian fiction. I always have. I love lesbian fiction. I really do. Good, bad, pot boilers, I don't care. I read it all. I've been reading it all since I came out. I've been reading it all for 30 years. And I love it. But I get frustrated because more and more and more really crappy stuff is getting published. Self-published things that really didn't have an editor paying as much attention as they should. The old days are definitely gone, and there's a lot more lesbian fiction out there, but a lot of it is really subpar, in my opinion. And believe me, I read tons of crap. I have a very high crap threshold. But I read this one book, and it was the last straw. Now, I read a book on a bus. I take the bus to work every day. It gives me a good 40 minutes of uninterrupted time. I get in so early. I always get a seat on the bus. It's my quiet time. I sit down and I read. And I was reading this book that I had been plodding my way through. And I finished it, I closed it, and I just thought, I could do that. I was left feeling like I just had a really unsatisfying meal. I wanted something real. Now, I didn't think that I could particularly do a whole lot better, But I thought, I could certainly do that. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to. And so I pulled out a legal pad that I had in my bag, and I started writing. That was the day I started the book, and 3 weeks later it was done. And a week after that, I sold it.
Wow.
I write on the bus, which also explains, I think, a little bit of why the handwriting is so terrible. But also, you have to understand that most of what I do during the day, 12, 15 hours a day, is drafting legal documents and working on, briefs and memorandum and pleadings in front of a computer. Physically, it's a very different exercise than the act of writing by hand on a legal pad. So even though lawyers are writers, that's what we do. We write all the time. I tell my students, if you can't write, you're like a football player who can't run. Find another profession. Go to med school. Because you have to be able to write to be a lawyer, because that's all we do. We write. But it's a very different kind of writing. It's so liberating to be able to split an infinitive, to put contractions in your writing. I have to tell you, there's something this joyous about it. And that's what writing fiction allows you to do. So it's a completely different experience. It just doesn't feel like what I do all day anyway. And part of the way I make it such a different experience is by doing it by hand on legal pads, which is not at all what I do when I'm doing my legal work. So, that's how I started writing. That's how I get the books out. That's sort of my process. Everybody has a different process. I have to tell you, I did a panel over Columbus weekend in Provincetown about a year and a half ago with Radcliffe, who is another well-read, well-written, prolific lesbian writer who's very good, and Sarah Dreyer was there as well, and we were talking about our process, our writing process. It was a panel it was a benefit for some women's organization in Provincetown, and they put together this panel of lesbian writers. It promoted our books, and we also talked about our process. And, there were the three of us sitting there, and completely different styles, completely different organic ways of getting books out, completely different ways of thinking up plot lines and thinking of characters and story twists. Some people start with character and let the plot go on its own. Other people plot it out. Everybody's got a wholly different way of doing it. And that's actually, to me, something that's really interesting about hearing writers talk. You never know what's going to come out of their mouth. You never know how they end up doing it. And however they do it, that's their process. It's not necessarily what should be your process.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.